By closing the first session, I try to share some basics for the Eurozone architecture. And it is clear that these basics are a part of the problem of the debt sustainability. I was mentioning during my opening remarks that the euro starts with a gentleman agreement between the bureaucrats of that time. Italians were aware about the fact that by entering in this project, they would have lost the freedom of a weak lira. A lira that could adjust imbalances in order to keep our manufacturing system present all the time and able to help our competition inside the Europe, but also outside the European borders. But in a certain sense, since we were aware about the difficulty of managing the public debt, of managing fiscal evasion, corruption, the need of making reforms, we were aware that by having the Germanization of the interest rate, we would have been able to manage the expenses for our public debt. And that gains would have helped us to make the reforms. Unfortunately, in these 10 years after the starting of the euro, we slept. We did not do what we have to do. We left the country to its level of inefficiency. On the other side, in this agreement, Germany was aware about the fact that the presence of countries such as Spain and Italy would have, reduced the value of the Deutschmark and help the typical mercantilistic economy that is part of their history, of their tradition. And in a certain sense, the agreement has some substance because Italy, if we compare the dimension at that time of our manufacturing system with the one of Germany, we realized that we could lose something there in order to have a sort of proportionality inside the Eurozone between the different countries. It could be an agreement. And, the treatise was very clear on these points. What happens after the crisis is that some part of the European bureaucracy, in my personal view, in an hegemonical way, has decided that this agreement was no longer valid. And it starts with the declaration that, in my opinion, are borderline with the European Treaty about the fact that you should save your banks on your own, and also you should manage your debt on your own. But what about the harmony and convergency of the economic cycles that are within the European Treaty if you allow the financial market to bet on divergence, to bet on the possibility of having different interest rate term structure? What about the possibility of keeping a healthy competitive arena if the cost of capital is different in each country of the Eurozone? So what I want to know and to ask to my speaker is what they think about this deformation within the Eurozone after the beginning of the crisis. And specifically, if they think that it could be normal in the long run that the spread would remain within our currency. Because I make this question for one reason. we have a plenty of examples of fixed exchange rate regime that collapse. But pay attention. In all these regimes, we have different central banks and different currencies. So you can create a tension within the forex market. With the euro, the spread is the only valve that we have in order to adjust prices, and is not necessary that the euro would break up. It could continue. It's not like in those cases. So, with this consideration, I would start from Alessandro Settepani to tell us his view about this issue of the spread, the impact of the spread within our economies, how with this new equilibrium that actually we don't find on the book of political economy, we can continue, and if this new equilibrium could survive and last forever.
Well, I mean, it's a quite difficult topic. I would say, I mean, let's take a step back to 2011, when, you know, the Italian sovereign crisis started. At the time, we were already an outlier. We were already divergent from other European countries because we had higher public debt, a lower growth, a number of inefficiencies in our economy. So at that point in time, as you said, we were already divergent from the others. And this really created the problem of Italy. Because then, if you are divergent in your fundamental factors, then you get targeted by speculation. And as you rightly pointed out, we had basically a number of years which we wasted because we didn't take advantage of what you call Germanization of interest rates. So there is a fundamental problem in this country, which it's his own problem. It's not created necessarily by the euro or the situation, but it's really intrinsic to us. And I think that it's on this that we have to focus. Now, when the crisis started in 2011, we were in a situation when, basically, a number of European countries experienced financial crisis in the banking sector, and this crisis affected public finances. And therefore, a number of debt to GDP in Europe increased, including Germany, UK. Now, in Italy, it happened exactly the opposite. It was the problem in the public debt that transmitted to the banking sector and to the private sector. So what happened is that the crisis starts, spreads spike up. These affect immediately the banking sector due to the correlation between, you know, the public debt, the sovereign, and the banks. Banks start a credit rationing, so they stop giving credit. This affects the private sector, and we had a number of defaults. That these defaults didn't happen much because of austerity, or they happen because of liquidity crisis. Basically, banks closed the credit to the companies. So, in fact, I think that this is the, let's say, really shows us that our problem is, in fact, the public debt. It's the public debt that basically crowds out the private sector. Now, how do we come out of this situation, and is this situation sustainable? I mean, I'm very much surprised that even now in this situation, the idea of reducing public debt is completely out of the political agenda, as if this is absolutely unfeasible. And we think that this is unfeasible because we think that in order to grow, we need to spend more. So, I mean, a topic that I would like also to, to raise to the other speakers, is this really true? I mean, is really true that in order to grow, we need to spend more? And if yes, then what kind of expenditure we really need? Because it might even be that it's, in fact, it's potentially possible to spend less, to reduce the debt, and grow more. Why we have to exclude this possibility? And then if this is possible, then this situation could be sustainable even in the medium term. I don't know. I mean, I frankly speaking don't have the answer. I can just say that if you look, I mean, Italy is growing a little bit now. And if you look how this growth happened, there is a recovery in private investments and a slight recovery in private consumption. And then, of course, a big component of the growth is the export, so the external sector. But internally, there is an improvement in terms of consumption and private investment. If you read the Banca d'Italia relation of, on 2016, you will read basically the private investment was in fact favorably affected by the fiscal policy, the superammortamento, Industria 4, and in fact benefit from that. But the reason why private consumption started to increase a little bit was not really related to fiscal policy. It was more related to an increase in the purchasing power of families, and that was simply due to deflation. The fact that prices went down and families could afford to buy more. So we always think about deflation as, like a big problem, but in fact, it did give benefits to Italian families. And then also the fact that now banks, the financial system is lending again to families, so they manage to increase consumptions also via financing. So when you decide to spend, probably you should really think, what the right mix, even if you are constrained for many reasons, what the right mix of your fiscal policy should be, because there are measures which are really effective in fostering growth, other measures which probably were a little bit useless. Maybe they had a political value, definitely, but if these resources were in fact used to try to reduce public debt, maybe we would have been a little bit better off exposed. So my point is it's very difficult to say if this is sustainable or not, but I think that as a country we should first of all assess our problems and recognize that our problem is not necessarily the euro, but our problem is the high public debt that we have, that we need to reduce in a fair way, and also that we should be brave enough to rethink the way we have thought so far in terms of what is the real, the right mix of fiscal policy, and if what we have been doing for the past 30 years, 40 years, Italy has always been in like trying to, I mean, we always grew the debt because we pay interest on that, but also because we think that, by, spending a little bit more, maybe we can foster growth. But that might not necessarily be true in Italy at this moment, especially if when you spend, so when you spend more, you're not really credible because, people know that you might even give them 50 euros, 100 euros more to be spent, but being more or less rational, they might decide to save it instead of spend it if you're not credible as a fiscal agent.
Thanks, Alessandro. I think that we can continue with a second view of a person that is really expert and comes from the market, and so can give us some insights and give his view about the topic that we are discussing. Antonio, can you share with us what you think about these issues?
Thank you for inviting me, and it's very difficult to come in as a discussion after this roster of speakers. I must say that maybe because we share the discussion role, I agree with most of what Mr. Settepani has just said. But let's me, if we want to take a little bit of a higher viewpoint on the whole issue, let me start from the sixth paradox that Professor Masera highlighted. We live in a complex system. I think we all agree on that. We live in a complex system in the very mathematical and physical sense of the term, a system that is populated by fallible individuals and institutions that have to act on the basis of imperfect knowledge. When you analyze from a physical point of view this sort of system, of which there are many in nature, it becomes obvious that you cannot really predict the long-term interaction and outcomes of policies and regulatory impulses, of which we are giving a lot. The only impact that this policy that you can predict is the very short-term impact of this policy. And all the policies that have been taken since the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis have been policies of containment, short-term policies, and we don't understand the long-term ramification of those, yet those policies were quite successful in basically cooling down the original problem. And so now we're left in a situation where the original problem, whether it was the banking system or the Eurozone, are not resolved, yet they are cold, so politically intractable, because you cannot steer a crisis from cold. In a way, the issues that this country has, that were highlighted by the spread, have gone dormant, because having no spread, there is no pressure whatsoever on the country to actually do what many of the speakers have suggested we need to do. So for a country that has, as we say, the problem in its public spending, in its administration and so on, and with issues of corruption and so on, the proposal to actually spend more, because now this time we will do it in a better way, if you have not resolved the original issue, is actually not credible. So we need more, not less spreads. Because only under the pressure of a spread, this country that has the willingness and the means to actually resolve its problem, will actually begin to do it, and will actually contain the spread. But without this pressure that has been taken out of the market, it is going to be impossible to do that. And it is also awkward that we fail to acknowledge also our level of ignorance. There are many things that we don't understand, and we should start by being respectful of what we don't understand rather than kicking it around. For instance, inflation. Yes, it's easy to know that we need inflation to decrease the real value of a pile of debt. Yet, as Settepani was highlighting, in an aging country where most of the population rely, when they age, on a fixed income stream, decreasing the real value of that might not be in the best interest of the population at large. Interest rate. We've been kicking interest rate all the way down to levels not seen in history. The long-term chart of interest rate that you see are telling an even worse story, because for most of the period, when you look back for centuries, interest rates were supposed to be on a currency that was backed by gold. Today, it's low interest rate, record low interest rate, backed by a fiat currency only. Yet we don't have, we have no idea of what the interaction, long-term interaction of low interest rate with the economy actually is. We lowered them to make that more sustainable, which is the only thing that happened. Yet by doing so, we basically stopped in its track every hint of Schumpeterian creative destruction in industry, because at the same time as we are bailing out government, we are bailing out entire industries. And there's no surprise that if you don't reduce the unproductive excess capacity that we have, we won't see investments. Also because even Keynes had told us that interest rates are not the reward for saving, they are the reward for not hoarding. So in order to encourage people to invest, you have to give them a return. Otherwise, they will just hoard their wealth rather than invest it. Also, the interaction between debt and money is something that we thought we knew, and the crisis told that we don't. I mean, who of us would have thought 10 years ago that you could issue the sort of amount of public debt that has been issued since the beginning of the crisis, monetize a good part of it, and have no inflation? We discovered that there is actually a substitution between money and government debt, and that our definition of money is probably wrong and too narrow, to an extent that we didn't know before. So when you're faced with a complex system where you are not sure that you actually know the rules that are behind him, when you know that you are faced with mistakes, the last thing to do is to basically concentrate power and decision making, and the banking situation is the best way to show you that. We have this global financial crisis, from which also the Eurozone crisis derived, because of the massive mistakes that were made in banking regulation. We are now 10 years after the crisis almost. Bank capital has roughly doubled in Europe. Prudential capital requirements have been multiplied by 4 or more, which begs the question that nobody asked of why on earth were they set at a level that was so wrong before. And even today, at the current capital level, I can tell you from a market experience that if you take your average hedge fund and risk weight its assets on the basis of Basel II, you discover that your average hedge fund, you know, those bad guys in the so-called shadow banking system, actually they run their operation with between 4 and 6 times as much capital as a bank does. So after 10 years, we still have not recognized the mistakes we made in banking regulation. And we are demonizing the market-based finance by misnaming it shadow banking. Yet, probably, we were dealing with an industry and a set of regulators that were entirely obsolete. I cannot think of a single business that banks were doing where in the last 50 years we have not seen the evolution of new intermediaries that are much more efficient and less leveraged and far less risky. And we have only created some backstops for both the regulators and the banking industry to continue as before, while a big burst of flames should have ridden us of basically institutions that had grown obsolete over the last 200 years. But I think I can stop here.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Antonio. This is exactly one point on which we have discussed several times. It is impressive, I mean, that there are a lot of groups within Europe, Eurozone, and also outside that discuss about these pieces of regulation, how an architecture like the Euro one should evolve. And eventually, again, I come back to my original point. We forgot the basics. I mean, that just by looking at some figures, what is happening, you find some answers. And I mean, what Alessandro was saying, yes, our gross domestic product is growing again, but the determinants are completely different with the one of Germany. And so even if the figure, the single number, is not too much distant like in the past, The point is that part of our growth comes from people that after 7 years should change the washing machine and make this by, taking some private debt. So it's a completely different determinant. And as Antonio was saying, it's also important to realize that if we have done a doom loop between state and banks, and we don't realize that in terms of, we speak about capitalization, undercapitalization of banks, we have to face the problem of non-performing loans, and we don't realize that there are more efficient industry that have just, let's say, decided to move the other way around and to change their attitude towards risk and towards capital requirements. I will start now by continuing this very interesting debate, because we are sharing ideas in this cauldron, and then we are, warming what is inside, and we'll see the final soup, what will be. I will ask by following what the original, order of speakers, and so I will ask Rainer if he want to add some points to our Rainer to our debate, and then Jochen, and then Wolfgang to finish our first virtuous loop discussion.
I will be brief, and I thank you again for this opportunity to take up the floor again. Let me touch again on a point which I have already made. This is the problems lie fundamentally in Italy. We were not asked to join the euro, to take part in the euro area right from the beginning. Indeed, the contrary was true. My German friends told me that in a number of ways they tried to convince Prodi and Ciampi that perhaps it would have been wiser to have the structural reform first and then to join the euro. But though we wanted to be the first in the class, we had to be there. How can Rome left out of an exercise which was started in Rome itself? But Prodi and Ciampi promised what they did, what Italy was unable to achieve, a declining debt-to-income ratio. First point. Second point, and you yourself, Marcello, made the point earlier on. The problems with the main problem, I would say the main problem of Italy is the lack of productivity. The lack of productivity is the heart of our problems, because if you look carefully at the debt-to-income ratio, unless you have growth, you're unable to reduce meaningfully that deficit. And this started 20 years ago, largely because we had poor quality of expenditure, notably investment expenditure. And a question to you, Alessandro. I take your point, but is it possible to improve our current and prospective position without new spending in good investment? I would submit that no, this is not the case. We must invest more. We must invest more in the private sector, which is trying to do something intelligent along these lines. Industry 4.0 is a good starting point. And here again, Industry 4.0 was introduced in Europe, not by Italy, but by Germany. Let us recall these basic facts. And therefore, I would remind these factors, and I stand by what I have argued earlier on. Unless we have good quality investment expenditures and ways and means to achieve this result, it will be very difficult for Italy to avoid the vicious trap to which we made allusion first. I fully accept the logical argument that Minenna presents in his book, which is praised by Romano Prodi. That is to say, let us add a second fundamental objective to the ECB, that is to say, a zero spread. Now, I'm old now, but I can assure you that I don't think this is a possibility. Why? Because not only our German friends, but some friends do not believe that we would use this degree of freedom in the proper way. And this is again the heart of the problem. You indicated this. We have abolished the exchange rate signal, danger signal, and they claim if we avoid also the excessive, perhaps, danger signal coming from the spreads, we are bound to have a system where you, Italy, would continue to work along the lines you followed in the past 20 years. And I must confess, I concur, at least in part, with these views. One final point. I am one of those who are convinced that the zero interest rates or negative interest rate policy is fundamentally wrong for moral as well as economic reasons. I can take your point that there can be in the short run advantages from this policy, but the whole of our pension system and the pension systems of Germany and other countries is based on the fact that there is a 2 to 3% real rate of growth, which is the representation of the savings which the German, the Italian, and other populations put into the pension funds. I take, and I close here, I take this point to indicate to our German friends that, having said that, I concur with the view that having constant, huge surpluses. I recall that the German and Dutch surpluses for the past decade were over 1 trillion, well over 1 trillion euros, equaling perhaps on average 75, 80%. In the case of the Netherlands, 100% of GDP. Now, this is not necessarily a good case for the country which claims that we should increase interest rates. But the problem is that if all countries were to behave in the same way with a huge excess of savings over investment, interest rates would be even lower than they are now. So it's a balance between various factors which have to be taken into account, and above all, a rethink of certain fundamental tenets. Mr. Vice President, you indicated this earlier on. Conventional wisdom is not necessarily wrong, but it can be very wrong. And we must have the possibility and the opportunity, and this is a very welcome opportunity, to rediscuss some of the tenets of conventional wisdom which may hide the truth and not even allow to reach for a different truth. Thank you.
Thank Rainer for your consideration. And now I ask Jochen to add on this debate. I will force my role as a moderator and tell, please, Jochen, with all the things that you have said, let's try to not discuss about Italian debt restructuring. At least let's read the last paper of the European Central Bank. It's a paper of two researchers. It's not a policy of the Directive Council that they have analyzed what could have happened within the Eurozone if we would have used the Eurobond from the beginning, and they arrive with some econometric analysis that all the Eurozone would have growth much more together than, the situation where we are. Also because, my personal opinion, but I repeat, sometimes I have much more mechanic in my analysis due to my original background. If we try a similar solution, or we think that we can manage risk just by inserting new clause on the public debt like the CPC that face the redenomination risk in a more stronger way than the CAC, in any case, we enter in a sort of, off ground where the situation is not necessarily clear. Because the kind of variables are so huge that eventually, in order to make prediction, you have to insert 4, 5, 6, 10 dummy variables. And in this case, I like to say what a professor of mine in New York like to say, Marcello, when you add more than 3 dummy variables to your model, you are producing random numbers. And so I don't want to analyze a similar scenario like the debt restructuring, because in my opinion, in this situation, with all the variables that are inside the Eurozone and outside, in my opinion, we would enter definitely in a definitely not known ground. In any case, I don't want to insist too much, and so obviously feel free of considering in whatever field.
Well, 2 caveats. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I have not read the adorable paper, and I have not meant to present your proposal that's brand marked on Italy. That's certainly not the case. It cannot be the case. It would not be the case. So that is not the idea here. I was struck by Wolfgang's comments of the lack of consensus, because actually I find there's a lot of consensus in this room about the way forward, and I think so far many speakers have agreed that growth and investment is a real issue, and that here the responsibility remains with the national authorities, and that's I think that's a big consensus, and I'm glad about that. I think also with investment it squares well with the emphasis I put on financial integration. This investment doesn't need necessarily to come from Italians in Italy and Germans in Germany. They can be, cross-border. So that also, I think, there's ground for consensus. And then ultimately, some, not all, agreed on market discipline playing a role. I mean, spread differentiation playing a role. That said, I was also struck by how easily how highly some corners are talking about monetary autonomy, which basically implies for a country that already is part of the economic and monetary union an exit from the euro area. That's a Pandora's box that I cannot recommend to discuss very lightly. Which, first of all, if countries introduce their own currency and leave the euro area, that means most likely a strong devaluation, which, at least in euro terms, means high costs to all those who have assets. So if you run calculations, these costs exceed by far, in my calculations, 3 times, any costs that a sovereign default, and that's not likely, not desirable to happen either, it exceeds it by 3 times. So it's an illusion that this is an easy route out, and it's basically an impoverishment of households. So I would be very careful treating here. The other thing is, of course, with monetary authority, one needs to use it wisely, of course. And I think there's a good reason that the euro area came together, because it's not that easy to control inflation, to be credible, and have the trust of investors, as everybody would like to have to finance the investments. And ultimately, it's also not easy to sever ties with the euro area or the EU at all. And I think we have to wait how Brexit going to pan out. But I think it's everything else than easy. And I think economically, it's also not fulfilling the promises of those who said that Brexit will be beneficial for the UK. And then my third and last point will be on many other proposals that point to the need of mutualization and risk sharing through mutualization. It's of course the most easy thing, and one could can easily say this is solidarity and that's how it should work. But I mean, what one needs to think about that is how to ensure that liability and control remain in one hand, and that's anything but easy to do for Eurobonds. Countries would need basically, I mean, Eurobond can only work if there's also an income stream for which a Eurobond to service. So that means that countries need to earmark revenues, part of the taxes, and add on to the VAT and add on to mineral oil taxes or different proposals have been floated. That's giving up sovereignty. Are countries ready to give up sovereignty? Well, maybe we are going that way. I think actually it would not be a bad way, even when Minister Schäuble talks about the finance minister, that's what probably is behind that. But it incurs this compromise. And also in other areas, we're talking about deposit insurance, backstop for the sovereign, for the single resolution fund, all these kind of things. One needs to make sure that liability and control remain in one hand, or at least partly so. That's a consistent way. And that's not easy to achieve. It usually means that the nation states have to give up some of economic or fiscal policy making sovereignty. Thank you.
Thanks, Jochen, for your consideration. As you can see, the debate is taking the right ingredients, because we have, in a certain sense, positive and negative. Sooner or later, they would attract, at least because the magnet that is the euro is quite clear to everybody. Jochen speak about solidarity when he discussed about the Eurobond. Actually, I mean, since we have been 150 years of history of a fixed exchange rate regime with the lira between the north and the south, I don't believe that the intervention of the state in order to rebalance the difference of the two economies is a solidarity. It's just because if you share the currency, you have to understand that there is nothing that can rebalance the imbalances, because you don't have the exchange rate. And so, in any case, I would like to hear Wolfgang on these points, also because I know that he has also an original view on this, by reading his op-ed often, I would say always.
Thank you. I would like to answer your original question, and that also links into Jochen's comment, which is can the Eurozone, not talking about Italy now, can the Eurozone be suboptimal or be sustainable at a suboptimal growth rate? I mean, we all have, Italy hasn't had productivity growth for 20 years. Italy hasn't had productivity growth for 20 years. Greece has had a recession for 8 years or 9 years now, continuously. The question is, Greece didn't leave the Eurozone. So the question then arises, okay, is it possible, because it is so hard to leave the Eurozone, that everyone gets locked into some kind of a suboptimal currency union? And it is indeed very hard to leave the Eurozone. It's not easy, and these proposals of parallel currencies haven't worked in the past because nobody was prepared to do this, and it is highly risky. So I acknowledge that. However, there is our human experience is that if something is unsustainable, it ends or it becomes sustainable. We cannot assume that just because it's difficult to get out of the Eurozone for technical reasons, it will never happen, because maybe one day someone will find a way to do this. So the necessity to fix the problems are still there. And the principles by which the euro was founded didn't work. It worked for Germany, it didn't work for others, it worked for the Netherlands, it didn't work for Italy, it didn't work for Greece. You can blame certain politicians for not delivering reforms, but that's the political reality in which we live. So the question is this sustainable? And my answer is yes, in the short run it is, but eventually will come the point when a country like Germany wants current account surplus of 8% for a very, very long period of time, and if there is either no growth in the rest or a current account deficit in the rest, that sort of seems to be the trade-off between where the south of Europe seems to be living in. That is not a sustainable equilibrium. It's as simple as that. And whether this comes to an end by force or through some policy action, it might just be resolved through some kind of policy proposal. But it is as we are today, the Eurozone with its no intervention, no bailout, no mutualization, single mandate ECB, if we continue that, it will end. Absolutely, it will end. And somebody will ultimately pull the plug. And it may not be the next government in a particular country or the government after this, but somebody will eventually say this is not sustainable. Or there may be a referendum, a political development. But countries will not in perpetuity suffer 0% growth when they could have had a better, when there are alternatives. This is not going to happen. It's against all human experience.
With this human experience, I will ask two very brief interventions to Antonio and Alessandro to comment on what we have done. We have more or less 7-8 minutes, so I will ask to be very concise in order to be in time. Antonio, I would ask you to start, and then Alessandro to close with some remarks. Okay, and then we will have the break.
So we have two major cognitive mistake, going into a common currency area without realizing that we were entering into a gold standard where all the public debt was becoming debt in a foreign currency. We had a crisis. We are now several years after the crisis. The issue has not been tackled. Why? Because also there was very early in the crisis between 2008 and 2012 the bailout of basically Germany. German banking system was bailout spending 14% of GDP before we had rule that forbid that. And the German banking system was also bailout through Target 2 that allowed the repatriation of all the bad lending that Germany had done through the current account surplus to the rest of Europe through Target 2, so without paying for the mistakes they did. So of course after 5 years that this has happened, the problem is cold and it's very difficult now to revive it and recreate the tension and build for the solidarity that is required. We are talking about growth. In order to have growth, since we cannot count on the demographic, we have to count on productivity. And this is a country where you can, I think, have massive increases in productivity by freeing up and revaluing the role of entrepreneurs. This is a country where entrepreneurs are bogged down by an impossible web of rules and regulation that stymies most economic activity, not to speak in my sector. Finally, we need to improve public spending and improve investment, yes, but even in these countries, the reforms that have been advocated are very, very tame. I think that based on my Swiss experience, we need some very radical federalism by pushing the decision to raise taxes and how to spend those taxes much more to a local level and create a direct link between the taxer and the spenders, which we have seen elsewhere in the world can do miracles.
Thanks, Antonio. Alessandro.
I mean, my final point would be that, I'm not that pessimistic in terms of, potential growth for the euro area and also for Italy. I mean, there are signs that something is happening. Maybe it's not brilliant, but something is happening. I think we need definitely to understand, assess our problem as an economy. And in the euro area, we need really to commit ourselves to convergence. Is it really possible to converge? Well, definitely not in the short term, not drastically, but I think it is possible for Italy to reduce the debt to GDP ratio over time. How? I mean, you need to find the right mix of policies. As you said, it's very important that investment is in fact taken into consideration, private and public. And also we need to keep very high in the political agenda the idea that we need to reduce public debt, because public debt is a problem for the country. Of course, we have to do it in the right way, but I think it's possible. If we start this process even by 1%, just a little bit, I think we will create a momentum that really will make the things happen. So I'm still optimistic.
Thanks, Alessandro, for these words. What can I say? I thank you all, you ladies and gentlemen, for your participation, for your patience, for having been all this time with us on this complex matter. We are running out of time, so we cannot have a Q&A question, but we have now a break, so we can, and you can discuss with all the speakers that I thank very much. My last conclusion is this one. Hic manebimus optime. Does the euro fit the case? Thank you very much again.